It's the year 1817. The war is over. The revolution is long past. And for the first time in its short history, America is at peace. You walk down a crowded street in New York City. Steamboats are arriving at the docks fresh off the Atlantic, their bellies full of goods from Europe. Blacksmiths hammer away in their shops. But across town, something new is rising, a factory powered by not muscle but by steam. Out west, settlers push into newly acquired lands, eager for opportunity. But on southern plantations, slavery is more entrenched than ever, fueling both economic prosperity and growing unrest. The newspapers call it the era of good feelings, a time of national unity and optimism. The war had proven that America could stand against the greatest empire in the world. The economy was expanding, new inventions are changing daily life, and politically, the nation felt more united than ever. But beneath the surface, not everything was as harmonious as it seemed. Welcome back to US History Understanding This Country. I am Santosh, and today we are stepping into a new chapter of America's story, one of growth, innovation, and rising tensions. This was an era of technological breakthroughs, economic expansion, and political shifts, but also deepening divisions that would shape nation's future. Before we begin, if you are enjoying this podcast, don't forget to follow, rate, and share. Your support helps bring this podcast to life, and I appreciate every listener tuning in. Now, let's dive into the so called era of good feelings, a time of optimism and national pride, but also one where cracks in the American experiment were already beginning to show. As the smoke of the War of 1812 faded into memory, a new feeling swept across the young United States: pride, unity, and a renewed sense of identity. For the first time, Americans saw their country not as a fragile experiment, but as a strong, independent power capable of holding itself against the mighty Britain. This period, roughly from 1815 to 1825, became known as the era of good feelings, a phrase first coined by a newspaper writer after a tour of the country by President James Monroe. Monroe, a Revolutionary War veteran and the last founding father to hold the presidency, had just taken office in 1817, and under his leadership, the nation appeared more united than ever before. The bitter political rivalries between Federalists and Democratic Republicans had faded. The economy was booming and the expansion seemed inevitable. But was it truly an era of good feelings, or was it simply a moment of calm before the storm? In the years following the war, American nationalism soared. The victory at the Battle of New Orleans, though fought after the war had technically ended, had given the country a sense of military pride. The Star Spangled Banner written during the bombardment of Fort Henry became a symbol of American resilience. For the first time, Americans began thinking of themselves not just as Virginians or New Yorkers, but as part of a unified nation. The government began investing in projects that would strengthen its national identity. New roads, canals, and protective economic policies that aimed to make America less dependent on foreign trade. Politically, the disappearance of Federalist Party left only one dominant party, the Democratic Republicans, which created an illusion of political harmony. With Monroe running virtually unopposed for re-election in 1820, many believed that the age of political division was over. But beneath the surface, tensions were slowly beginning to rise between North and South, industry and agriculture, free states and slave states. The very expansion that made America stronger also made it more fragile, as each new territory raised the same old question: would it be a free state or a slave state? At the same time, a new economic and industrial revolution was brewing. As Monroe championed national unity, a new economic philosophy was emerging, one that would reshape how America built, traded, and prospered. As the country emerged from the War of 1812, it faced a critical question: how should the country grow and strengthen its economy? The war had exposed many weaknesses: poor infrastructure, reliance on foreign trade, and a lack of a strong national bank. The answer to these problems came in the form of an ambitious economic plan known as the American System. This vision, championed by Henry Clay, a rising political leader from Kentucky, sought to make the United States economically self sufficient, reducing dependence on Europe and strengthening national unity through three main pillars: a stronger national bank, protective tariffs encouraging American industry, and internal improvements like roads, canals, and other infrastructures. During the War of 1812, the US had struggled financially. The First Bank of the United States had expired in 1811, and without a central bank to stabilize currency and provide credit, the government faced severe financial difficulties. To fix this, Congress established the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. This bank would standardize currency, making trade across states easier. It will provide loans for businesses and infrastructure projects, and it would regulate state banks, preventing reckless lending that could lead to financial crisis. While controversial, especially among those who distrusted federal power, the bank helped create a more stable national economy. Before the war, American manufacturers had struggled to compete with British imports, which were often cheaper and higher quality. After the war, many leaders saw economic independence as just as important as political independence. To protect American factories, Congress passed the Tariff of 1816, placing higher taxes on imported goods. This tariff encouraged Americans to buy domestic products, fueling the growth of textile mills, ironworks, and factories, especially in the North. However, the South opposed these tariffs. Southern farmers relied on exporting cotton and wanted cheaper imports from Europe rather than expensive goods from Northern manufacturers. Though the tariff helped boost industry, it also deepened the economic divide between North and South. With more industry and trade came another problem: transportation. Moving goods from farms and factories to market was slow and expensive due to poor roads and lack of canals connecting different regions. The American system called for federal investment in roads, canals, and other infrastructure projects to connect the country. One of such projects was called the National Road or the Cumberland Road, the first federally funded highway stretching from Maryland to the western frontier. And another project was the Erie Canal, completed in 1825, which linked the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, transforming New York into a nation's biggest trade hub. These improvements made westward expansions easier, boosted trade, and tied the country together economically. However, the issue of who should fund these projects, states or the federal government, remained controversial. The American system transformed the economy, promoting manufacturing, improving transportation, and strengthening the financial system. But it was also widening regional tensions. The North benefited from industry and tariffs, while the South saw them as a burden. As the economy changed, so did the way Americans lived and worked. The country was entering a new age of technology and industrialization, one that would revolutionize transportation, communication, and manufacturing. As America moved into the early 19th century, a profound transformation began to reshape how people lived, worked, and built their futures. The Industrial Revolution, which had started in Britain in the late 1700s, was now making its way across the Atlantic, changing the economic landscape of the United States forever. For most of the American history, work had been done by hand. Artisans crafted goods one at a time, farmers relied on simple tools, and transportation was slow and unreliable. But new technologies and manufacturing methods were about to accelerate everything, fueling a shift from small scale local economies to large scale industrial production. At the heart of this revolution were several key innovations, each of which had far reaching consequences for different parts of the country. For centuries, manufacturing was done one piece at a time. If a musket broke, a gunsmith had to custom make a replacement part because no two guns were exactly the same. This changed in early 1800s when Eli Whitney, an American inventor, introduced the concept of interchangeable parts. Whitney had already revolutionized cotton production with his cotton gin, but his real game changer was mass production using standardized parts. By designing machines that could create identical components, factories could assemble products faster at a lower cost, replace broken parts easily rather than having to rebuild something from the scratch. It also helped mass production of weapons, tools, and machinery, making large-scale production possible. This method became foundation of modern manufacturing and allowed the United States to compete economically and militarily with industrialized European nations. The Industrial Revolution wouldn't have been possible without a reliable source of power. Early factories had relied on water wheels, which required them to be built near rivers and streams. But when James Watt perfected the steam engine, everything changed. With steam power, factories could now be built anywhere, not just along the rivers. This allowed industrialization to spread beyond coastal cities and into new regions. Steam engines powered steamboats and locomotives, which made river travel faster and more efficient and revolutionized land transportation and would later fuel the expansion of railroads. In effect, steam shrunk distances, increased economic opportunity, and helped fuel America's rapid growth. While canals and turnpikes improved transportation, nothing would change the country more than railroads. In 1825, British engineer George Stephenson built the first steam powered railroad in England. Within a decade, the technology reached America and the rail lines began to spread across the Northeast and beyond. Railroads connected distant markets, making trade faster and more efficient, and it boosted westward expansion, making it easier for settlers to move west. And it also fueled the industrial growth since iron, coal, and steel production surged to meet demand. By the 1830s and 40s, railroads were becoming the backbone of America's economy, shaping how people and goods moved across the country. As transportation improved, so did communication. Before the telegraph, sending messages across country would take weeks or months. But in 1837, an American inventor, Samuel Morse, introduced a device that would revolutionize the speed of information, the telegraph. Using electrical signals transmitted over wires, the telegraph allowed people to send messages in minutes instead of weeks, and it coordinated businesses and trade across vast distances, and it improved military and government communication. By 1840s, telegraph lines were spreading rapidly, connecting cities and making America feel smaller and more unified than ever before. While new technologies were revolutionizing the country, not all regions benefited in the same way. The North embraced factories, steam power, and railroads, leading to rapid urbanization and industrial growth. The South remained heavily agricultural, relying on cotton plantations and enslaved labor rather than embracing industrialization. The West has been settled at a fast pace, with railroads and canals helping link to the eastern markets. This very economic divide would intensify tensions between North and South as industrialization strengthened the free labor economy in North while deepening the reliance on slavery in the South. The Industrial Revolution brought incredible progress, but it also highlighted the growing sectional differences that would soon boil over into national conflict. Technology was shaping America's economy, but it also fueled deeper moral and political battles. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the issue of slavery, which was becoming more entrenched in the South even as resistance against it was growing. As the Industrial Revolution transformed the North into a bustling hub of factories, railroads, and commerce, the South remained deeply rooted in plantation agriculture and slavery. The cotton gin, though a technological marvel, had made slavery more profitable than ever, fueling economic expansion but also intensifying moral and political differences. By the 1820s and 30s, slavery was no longer just an economic system. It had become the defining issue of American life, shaping politics, culture, and regional identities. As the South became more entrenched in its defense of slavery, resistance, both from enslaved people and abolitionists, began to grow stronger. In the South, wealth and power were concentrated in the hands of large plantation owners who saw slavery as the backbone of their economy and way of life. Many Southern leaders argued that slavery wasn't just a necessary evil but a positive good, an institution that kept society stable. In the North, however, a growing number of Americans were calling for abolition. While slavery had been already outlawed in many northern states, the North was still connected to the slave economy through textile mills that depended on southern cotton. Still, abolitionist voices, both black and white, were growing louder, challenging the moral and economic justification of slavery. As the fight over slavery intensified, enslaved people themselves were resisting in ways both large and small. For many enslaved individuals, resistance took many forms, some subtle and others open and defiant. Some resisted through work slowdowns, sabotage, or escape. Many fled north via the growing Underground Railroad, a secret network of safe houses and abolitionist allies helping enslaved people reach freedom. Others took more direct action, leading armed revolts against their oppressors. One of the most significant of these revolts was led by Nat Turner. In 1831, Nat Turner, a deeply religious enslaved man in Virginia, led one of the most infamous slave uprisings in American history. Turner and his followers moved from plantation to plantation, killing slave owners and freeing enslaved people along the way. The rebellion struck fear into the heart of Southern elite, who responded with brutal crackdowns, executing rebels and passing stricter slave laws to prevent future uprisings. Though Turner's rebellion was crushed, it sent shockwaves through the nation. In the North, abolitionists pointed to the rebellion as proof that slavery was unsustainable and unjust. In the South, plantation owners tightened their grip, making slavery even more restrictive and violent. While enslaved people fought back directly, abolitionist movements were gaining momentum in the North. Figures like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and William Lloyd Garrison took to the press and public speeches, spreading the message that slavery had to end. Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, founded in 1831, was one of the first publications to demand immediate and total abolition of slavery, rejecting any compromise. His words inspired a new generation of activists but also sparked violent backlash in the South. Down south, many viewed abolitionists as dangerous radicals trying to destroy their way of life. The fight over slavery was no longer just a debate, it was turning into an all out political and cultural war. And as the country expanded westward, the question of whether new states would allow slavery would soon ignite one of the most divisive political battles in American history. By 1820, sectional tensions over slavery had reached a breaking point. The debate over whether new states would allow slavery wasn't just about local economies, it was also about a political power in Congress. Each new state had potential to tip the balance between free state and slave states. And with every addition to the Union, the question became more urgent. The flashpoint for this crisis came when Missouri applied for statehood. At the time, the US had 22 states, 11 free and 11 slave states. It created a delicate balance in the Senate. Since free states had larger populations, House of Representatives already leaned towards the North. But in the Senate, where each state had two votes, slave states and free states had equal representation. If Missouri ended as a slave state, it would give South the advantage. If it ended as a free state, the North would gain control. Either way, the balance that had kept the country together would be broken. Northern politicians, led by James Talmadge of New York, argued that Missouri should be a free state. They proposed that no more enslaved people should be brought into Missouri and that those already there should be gradually freed. Southern leaders fiercely opposed this, seeing it as a direct threat to their way of life and a dangerous precedent for the future of slavery. The debate grew so intense that some feared it might lead to the breakup of the Union. Here comes Henry Clay again, the Kentucky senator known as the Great Compromiser. Clay proposed a solution that would temporarily ease tensions. Missouri would enter as a slave state. Maine, which had been part of Massachusetts, would enter as a free state, keeping the balance in the Senate as 12 free states and 12 slave states. Slavery would be banned in the rest of the Louisiana Territory north of the latitude 36 degrees and 30 minutes, meaning that future states north of that line would be free, while those south could choose slavery. After intense debate, Congress passed the Missouri Compromise in 1820, and the immediate crisis was averted. The nation breathed a sigh of relief, believing they had settled the slavery question for good. The Missouri Compromise delayed the national crisis, but it did not solve the underlying issue. It was just like a cellophane tape holding a gunshot wound. The North saw it as a victory. It stopped slavery from spreading into most of the Louisiana Territory. The South accepted it, but uneasily. It enforced the idea that slavery could be restricted by federal law, something they feared would eventually lead into its abolition. Both sides remained deeply suspicious of each other, and sectionalism only continued to grow. Thomas Jefferson, watching from his retirement, saw the compromise as a warning sign. He compared it to a firebell in the night, sensing that the issue of slavery had not been solved but merely postponed. And he was right. The Missouri Compromise had only kicked the can down the road. The question of slavery's future was still unanswered. And with every new expansion of the US territory, the debate would return, louder, angrier, and close to breaking the nation apart. The US had managed to hold itself together for now. But as the nation looked beyond its borders, it was clear that America's role in the world was changing. A new challenge was emerging: how to handle relations with powerful European nations and expanding influence in the Americas. As the United States expanded westward and strengthened its economy, it also found itself entangled in international affairs. Though the War of 1812 had ended, the US still had unresolved tensions with Britain and Spain. Once a dominant force in the Americas was losing its grip on its territories. The young nation, barely 40 years old, was beginning to assert itself on world stage. This period saw two major diplomatic developments: a new understanding with Britain that stabilized the relations and clarified US Canadian borders, and a bold move against Spain that led to the acquisition of Florida. After two wars with Britain in under 50 years, the United States had reasons to be wary of the former colonial ruler. But as 19th century progressed, both nations realized that they had more to gain from the cooperation than from conflict. The US and Britain negotiated several agreements that helped ease tensions and define their relationship moving forward. The Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817. This treaty limited naval forces on the Great Lakes, ensuring that neither country would militarize the border. It marked the beginning of a peaceful US Canada relationship. A trivia. When I wrote this script, I wrote a peaceful US Canada relationship which has lasted to this day. I would love to say that, but not sure how Canada or US would feel about that today. Okay. And the second one was the Convention of 1818. This agreement set the official boundary between US and British Canada at the 49th parallel from Great Lakes to the Rocky Mountains. It also allowed joint US British occupation of Oregon Territory, postponing future disputes over that land. These diplomatic efforts eased lingering hostilities, allowing both nations to focus on trade, expansions, and economic growth rather than conflict. But while relations with Britain were improving, the US was still eyeing Spanish controlled Florida, where tensions were rising. Spain, once the most powerful empire in the Western Hemisphere, was weakening. By the early 1800s, its vast empire was crumbling as Latin American countries fought for independence. And Florida, one of its last strongholds in North America, had become a major problem for the US. Florida had become a safe haven for runaway enslaved people escaping from southern plantations. It was home to Seminole Native American groups who often clashed with American settlers along Georgia Florida border. It was a loosely governed and Spain was struggling to maintain control over it. Seeing an opportunity, General Andrew Jackson, known for his aggressive military tactics, invaded Florida in 1818 without direct orders from Washington. Jackson's troops destroyed Seminole villages, captured Spanish forts, and even executed two British traders accusing of inciting native resistance. His actions created an international crisis. Spain was furious and Britain was deeply concerned about Jackson's treatment of British citizens. Some in Congress wanted to punish him, but Secretary of State John Quincy Adams saw Jackson's invasion as an advantage. Instead of disapproving Jackson, Adams used this as a leverage in diplomatic negotiations. Rather than go to war over Florida, Spain, realizing it had little power left to hold the territory, agreed to negotiate. In 1819, the US and Spain signed the Adams Onis Treaty, in which Spain ceded Florida to the US. The US gave up claims to Texas for now, and the western boundary of the Louisiana Purchase was clarified, drawing a firm border between US and Spanish controlled territory. This was a major victory for US, solidifying its control over the entire southeast and further asserting itself as a rising power in the Americas. But the US wasn't just focused on its border. It was also watching events unfold in Latin America, where Spain's colonies were fighting for independence. American leaders feared that European powers might try to reclaim these territories, which led to one of the boldest foreign policy declarations in American history, the Monroe Doctrine. By the early 1820s, the political landscape of the Western Hemisphere was changing rapidly. Spain, once mighty empire, was crumbling, and its colonies in Latin America were fighting for independence. Countries like Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, and Chile were emerging as new sovereign countries. For the United States, this posed both an opportunity and a threat. On one hand, these new republics shared America's anti colonial spirit, and their independence meant new economic and diplomatic relationships. On the other hand, European monarchies, including Britain, France, and Russia, were watching closely, and there were fears that they might try to reclaim these territories. In response, President James Monroe and his Secretary of State John Quincy Adams issued one of the most important foreign policy statements in US history, the Monroe Doctrine. On December 2nd, 1823, during his annual message to Congress, President Monroe made a bold declaration to the world. The Western Hemisphere was no longer open to European colonization. Any attempt by European powers to establish new colonies or interfere with independent nations in the Americas would be viewed as direct threat to the United States. The US would not interfere in European affairs. Just as America expected Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, the US would not get involved in European conflicts or politics. This policy sent a clear message: the Americas were for Americans, not for European empires. This was a big deal. At the time, the United States was still a young and relatively weak nation compared to the great European powers. The idea that the US could dictate terms to Britain, France, and Russia was incredibly ambitious. Some might even say arrogant. But the real muscle behind the Monroe Doctrine wasn't the US, it was Britain. Britain had no interest in seeing Spain or other European nations re establish colonies in Latin America. British merchants were eager to trade with the newly independent nations. The British naval power helped enforce the Monroe Doctrine, even though it was an American policy. The doctrine was more of diplomatic warning than an enforceable rule, but it became a cornerstone of US foreign policy. It would be invoked repeatedly throughout history, from dealing with European interference in the 19th century to Cold War policies in Latin America. At first, Europe mostly ignored Monroe's warning. The powerful monarchies of Europe dismissed the idea that US could tell them what to do. However, in reality, European nations largely stayed out of the Latin America, partly because of British influence and partly because they focused on internal European conflicts. But the Monroe Doctrine established a new role for the US, not just as an independent nation, but as a guardian for the Americas. It was an early sign of America's growing confidence on the world stage, a foreshadowing of its future role as global power. At home, however, another struggle was brewing, not over foreign policy, but over who would lead the nation next. The era of good feelings was coming to an end, and the presidential election of 1824 would mark a dramatic shift in American politics. And that's what we will start in the next episode. From the rise of industrial revolution to the growing divisions over slavery and sectionalism, we have explored how America was expanding both physically and politically. But as we have seen, the expansion came with deep conflicts that would only grow stronger in the years ahead. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow, rate, and share US History Understanding This Country. Your support helps keep this journey through history alive, and I truly appreciate each and every one of you tuning in. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and keep exploring history. Bye.